Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 34 of History for Shut-ins. Today, we will talk about the New York City draft riots, which take place right after the Battle of Gettysburg. We will also discuss the battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga in the Western Theater, and then we will move to the ascension of Ulysses S. Grant to the head of all Union armies and include in that discussion his very important relationships with Lincoln and William Tecumseh Sherman. So the draft riots took place in July of 1863, about a week after the Battle of Gettysburg ends. It took place over 4 days in New York City, resulting from anger with the unfairness of the draft. Although working people in general supported the Northern war effort, they had no voice in Republican policy and occasionally deserted from the Army or refused reenlistment. Due to their low wages, less than $500 a year annually, well, of course, that's what a year is. I meant on average, they were very upset with the provision that allowed affluent draftees to buy their way out of the federal army for about $300. Minor riots occurred in several cities throughout the North. When the drawing of names began in New York on July 11, 1863, mobs of mostly foreign-born workers, especially the Irish, surged onto the streets, assaulting residents, defying police, and attacking draft headquarters and burning buildings. If you've seen the movie The Gangs of New York, it's based on this. The New York draft riot was also closely associated with racial competition for jobs. Northern labor, and again, primarily new immigrants from Ireland, saw African American freedmen as their competition for jobs because many times employers would pay African Americans less for the same job than an Irishman would do or immigrant. So Northern labor feared that emancipation of slaves would cause an influx of African American workers from the South. White rioters vented their anger on homes and businesses of African Americans. The 4-day draft riot was finally quelled by New York City police and the 7th New York Regiment, which had been recalled from Gettysburg. Drawing of names for the draft proceeded on August 19th without incident. Hundreds were killed in the draft riots. There are estimates anywhere from 120 to 10 times that number, 1,200. So, really big deal. The Battle of Chickamauga takes place in mid-September 1863. Takes place from September 18th through September 20th. Union General William S. Rosecrans hoped to force Major General Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee out of Chattanooga. Rosecrans consolidated Union forces that had been scattered throughout both Tennessee and Georgia, forcing Bragg to evacuate Chattanooga. Bragg concentrated his forces in Lafayette, Georgia, and was determined to reoccupy Chattanooga. He followed the Union Army north, skirmishing with them at Davis's Crossroads. By the 17th of September, Bragg had been reinforced with Virginia divisions under General John Bell Hood and a Mississippi division under Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson. This is the first attempt to transport Confederate troops from one theater to another to achieve numerical superiority. It's rare in the war that the Confederates outnumber the Union Army. With renewed confidence that Chattanooga could return to the Confederates, on the morning of September 18th, Bragg marched his army to the west bank of Chickamauga Creek, hoping to wedge his troops between Chattanooga and the Union Army. As Bragg's infantry crossed the creek on the 18th, They skirmished with Union infantry and mounted infantry armed with Spencer repeating rifles. The Spencer repeating rifle allowed for 15 shots to be fired quickly, repeatedly. Confederates said that this rifle could be loaded on Sunday and fired all week. So it's another advantage in technology and weaponry that the North has over the South. Bragg had been hoping that his advance would be a surprise. Rosecrans observed Confederates marching in the morning and anticipated Bragg's plan. By the time Bragg's army crossed Chickamauga Creek, Union reinforcements had arrived. The battle began shortly after dawn on September 19th. Throughout the day, Bragg's men gained ground but could not break the extended Union line despite a series of aggressive attacks. The Confederates' luck changed when at 11 in the evening, Longstreet's divisions arrived at Chickamauga, giving the Confederate force superior numbers. Again, a rarity. Bragg divided his forces into two wings. Longstreet commanded the left. Lieutenant General Leonidas K. Polk was on the right. The battle resumed at 9:30 a.m. on September 20th with coordinated Confederate attacks on the Union left flank. About an hour later, Rosecrans, believing a gap existed in his line, ordered Brigadier General Thomas Wood's division to fill the gap. Wood knew the order was a mistake. No gap existed in the Union line, and moving his division would open a large hole in the Union position. Wood had been berated twice in the campaign for not promptly following orders. To avoid further grief, he immediately moved, creating a division-wide hole in the Union line. This was the chance that the Confederates needed. Longstreet massed a striking force, led by General Hood, of 8 brigades divided into 3 lines. Longstreet's men hammered through the gap that Wood had created. Union resistance at the southern end of the battlefield decreased as Union troops, including Rosecrans, were pushed off the field. George H. Thomas, a Union general, earned the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. He takes command and consolidates scattered Union forces on Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. Thomas and his men formed a defensive position. Although the Confederates continued to assault and came within feet of the Union line held firm. Thomas withdrew as darkness fell. Although Thomas urged Rosecrans to lead the army in an attack on September 21st, Rosecrans refused and stayed in Chattanooga. Bragg's army occupied the heights surrounding Chattanooga, blocking Union supply lines, but they did not pursue Rosecrans. While Chickamauga was a clear Confederate victory, casualties, as with many battles previously and really moving forward, are staggering. The Union had 16,000 casualties. The Confederates had 18,000 casualties. Chickamauga reached the highest losses of any battle in the Western theater. Remember the grief that Grant gets after Shiloh, which is really the first major battle in the Western theater. Chickamauga, there are more casualties than there were at Shiloh. Although the Confederates had driven Rosecrans from the field, they had not succeeded in Bragg's goals of destroying Rosecrans' army or reoccupying Chattanooga. Fighting would resume less than 2 months later in the battle for Chattanooga, which we will talk about next. So following Chickamauga, Rosecrans retreated to Chattanooga. Bragg, looking to capitalize on his victory, followed the Union to Chattanooga and established positions on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, putting Union troops under siege and cutting off Union supply lines. On October 17, 1863, Grant was given control over the newly created military division of the Mississippi, effectively putting all federal troops in the Western Theater, including the Army of the Cumberland, under Grant's control. In the days that followed, Grant learned Rosecrans was planning to withdraw the Army of the Cumberland from Chattanooga, surrendering the strategically important city, which of course goes against every fiber of Grant's being. Grant immediately replaced Rosecrans with Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and ordered Thomas to hold Chattanooga. Thomas responded, quote, "We will hold the town till we starve," unquote, because remember, the Union supply lines are cut off. To send support to the Army of the Cumberland, Grant set up what he called the Cracker Line to get food to soldiers at Chattanooga. On the 23rd of November, Grant received word from deserters of the Confederate Army that Bragg was withdrawing some of his brigades. Upon seeing columns of Confederates marching away from Missionary Ridge, Grant became concerned that Bragg was sending troops to reinforce the Confederates under Longstreet near Knoxville. To prevent this, Grant sent 14,000 men to engage a rear guard of only 600 Confederates at Orchard Knob. The Confederates were able to get off one volley before being totally overrun. Orchard Knob served as Grant's headquarters for the remainder of the battle. On the 24th of November, Joe Hooker struck the Confederate left at Lookout Mountain. Initially, Grant did not view taking Lookout Mountain as a priority. At the time of the attack, Grant directed Hooker to push on to Point Lookout if it became practicable. Hooker had 3 divisions under his command, led by Generals John W. Geary, Charles Cruft, and Peter J. Osterhaus. At 10:30, Geary's men made contact with Confederate General Edward Wathle's men 1 mile southeast of Point Lookout. The Confederacy's inferior numbers were quickly driven back. At 1 p.m., Confederate General John C. Moore launched a counterattack against the surging Union forces, but Confederates found themselves severely outflanked and retreated through the fog. That night, Bragg held a council of war and decided to withdraw from Lookout Mountain to reinforce Missionary Ridge, giving Grant the second victory of the battle. Initially, Grant wanted William Tecumseh Sherman to attack Missionary Ridge in coordination with Hooker's attack at Lookout Mountain. However, faulty intelligence led Sherman's men to Billy Goat Hill, which was physically separated from Missionary Ridge. Grant determined to follow up the success of November 24th with a coordinated effort on 11/25, November 25th. Hooker would advance on Missionary Ridge from the south, while Sherman would attack Tunnel Hill on the northern end of the Confederates' position. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was against the center of Bragg's line to offer assistance if it was needed. On the 25th of November, Sherman experienced early successes, but the Confederate counterattack routed the Federals, who were exhausted. The attack on Tunnel Hill came to a halt at 4 in the afternoon. On the Confederate left, Hooker found more success than Sherman. After arriving at Rossville Gap, the southernmost point of Missionary Ridge, Hooker launched a three-pronged attack that left the surprised Confederate troops surrounded. They quickly surrendered. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Grant ordered Thomas to demonstrate against the Confederate center, which would draw Bragg's attention away from Sherman. Thomas deployed 24,000 men. I mean, these numbers are incredible, against rifle pits at the base of the ridge. Union soldiers charged against the rifle pits and overran 9,000 Confederate defenders. Despite Grant's orders to the contrary, Thomas's men continued their charge, swarmed over the ridge, and overwhelmed the Confederate defenders. With no tactical reserves, the thinly manned Confederate line broke and fled Missionary Ridge, ending the siege of Chattanooga. Union possession of Chattanooga now opens the Deep South to Union invasion and sets the table for Sherman's march to the sea, which we will talk about later this week. On the 2nd of March, 1864, Lincoln promotes Grant to Lieutenant General. The only other person to have this rank in American history was George Washington. By doing so, Lincoln gives Grant command of all Union armies, answering only to Lincoln. Grant arrived in Washington, D.C. at the Willard Hotel on the 8th of March and was formally commissioned by Lincoln the next day at a cabinet meeting. Grant developed a good working relationship with Lincoln, who allowed Grant to devise his own strategy as long as Lee was defeated. Grant established his headquarters with Meade's Army of the Potomac in Culpeper, northwest of Richmond, and met weekly with Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in Washington, D.C. After protests from Halleck, who is one of the lead administrators, Grant scraps a risky invasion of North Carolina, adopting a plan of 5 coordinated Union offenses on 5 different fronts so that Confederate armies could not shift troops along interior lines. Grant and Meade would make a direct frontal attack on Lee, while Sherman, whom Grant named Chief of the Western Armies, was to destroy Joseph A. Johnston's Army of Tennessee and take Atlanta. Benjamin Butler would advance on Lee from the southeast up the James River, while Nathaniel Banks would capture Mobile, Alabama, which was a very important port. Franz Sigel was to capture granaries and rail lines in the Shenandoah Valley that supplied the Confederacy. Grant commanded 533,000 battle-ready troops across an 18-mile front, while the Confederates were losing many in battle and had great difficulty replacing them. And this is something that Grant understands, which is why Grant pushes it. He knows he's got superior numbers, in many cases superior weaponry. So although he will lose thousands of men in the upcoming overland campaign, which we will discuss tomorrow, he knows that he can replace these men. He gets the arithmetic, as Lincoln states. The relationship between Lincoln and Grant, in doing little more than designating the president as commander-in-chief and giving Congress the power to declare war, the Constitution does not provide any real guidance. The War of 1812 lacked national military organization or coordination on the part of the United States. The Mexican-American War saw President Polk's first appointment, Zachary Taylor, as his leading general to keep Winfield Scott out of the out of the limelight. And then what does Polk do? He replaces Taylor with Scott after Taylor has various military successes, all primarily for political reasons. As we get closer to the election of 1864, not only is Lincoln worried about reelection, but he's worried that Grant is going to run against him. Grant tells him, I have no designs politically. I'm a military man. I'm here to fight, and that's it. Lincoln's relationships with generals in chief, Scott, McClellan, and Halleck, were less than satisfactory. Between the terms of McClellan and Halleck, Lincoln and Stanton tried running the war without a designated general in chief, which also explains, it's almost like a vicious circle. Without effective leadership, they're not going to win any battles or many battles, and you're not going to win many battles if you don't have effective leadership, if I stated that correctly. So it was with the elevation of Grant and the quickly developing cooperation between Lincoln and Grant that an effective civilian military relationship becomes a reality. Their development of a civilian controlled, militarily effective relationship with virtually no precedent whatsoever provided a model for future American wars. Lincoln and Grant's positive relationship was expanded by similarities in their personalities and in their life experiences. Both were born in modest circumstances west of the Appalachians in what was regarded as the frontier in the early 19th century. They were men of the river, born near the Ohio and understanding the uses and value of America's inland river systems. Think about the importance that rivers played throughout the war, especially the Mississippi. They were humble, self effacing, working their ways from the bottom to the top of U.S. society. Both had their own internal demons that they had to battle, but they stubbornly pursued the critical goals of each of their lives, both separately and together. They overcame obstacles and eventually prevailed as two of America's greatest leaders, especially when needed most. Parallel experiences in their personal lives included marriages into slave owning families, distracting interferences from relatives, Lincoln from his wife, Grant from his father and father in law. Also, their different but effective interpersonal skills. Things got done quietly, efficiently, quickly, with no wasted motion. During combat, Grant remained calm. He did not panic. He persevered and never accepted defeat, even when he appeared to be beaten. Similar to Lincoln. Some of Lincoln's and Grant's positive attributes contrasted with and complemented those of the other. Lincoln was a political genius, while Grant had military skill. Unlike Jefferson Davis, Lincoln did not insist on micromanaging the war. Lincoln delegated more military authority to Grant as Grant earns Lincoln's confidence. Grant yielded to Lincoln's political expertise on most significant issues, including eventual emancipation and the use of African American soldiers. Grant deferred to Lincoln on most military strategic issues, showing that Lincoln was the senior partner in their partnership. However, it's Lincoln who says, as long as you crush Lee, I don't care how you get there. Grant's successful efforts in 1862 and 1863 to gain Union control over the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers reflected a Westerner's geographic awareness that wove with Lincoln's conception of the significance of those rivers to the country as a whole. They both got it. They're on the same page. When false reports of Grant's drinking show up, Lincoln states in response, and especially it comes up after Shiloh, so there are calls for Grant to be removed from command. Lincoln responds, quote, "I cannot spare this man. He fights." He goes on to say, unquote, by the way, he goes on to say, "Find out what he's drinking because I'd like to give it to my other generals." The most significant force that bound Lincoln and Grant was a shared belief in the necessity to proactively use appropriate and aggressive force to carry the North's burden of winning the war. So they know this is a war of conquest. They both do, as does Sherman, who we're going to talk about in a second. As you know, when the war first starts at the Battle of First Bull Run, everyone thinks, oh, it's going to be one battle, that's it, it's over. Well, it's after Bull Run, and relatively speaking, the casualties there are low, but it's after Bull Run where Lincoln says this is a war of conquest. Grant and Sherman formed the most important and successful military partnership of the war. As General-in-Chief of American armies and commander of what would now be called an Army Group, Grant and Sherman worked on a larger scale than Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Remember, it took Lee and Jackson a battle or two to get on the same page and work effectively. Big difference between Grant and Sherman and Lee and Jackson, and this is something that bothered Grant until the day he died. He would always say Lee only fought in Virginia. Grant fought in Maryland, fought a little bit in PA, but most of his fighting is in Virginia. Grant fights over the entire map, and he talks about the difficulties that are involved logistically, militarily, on and on in accomplishing that. So Grant and Sherman work on a much bigger canvas, if you will. Both were Ohio-born leaders, experienced, and they experienced personal and professional setbacks prior to the war. As the war starts, before the war starts, Grant's kicked out of the army for being drunk, for being an alcoholic. Sherman is thrown in a insane asylum, for lack of a better term, when he says that, hey, this is going to be a long, costly war. During the war, they saw that they could rely on each other. Lincoln, in turn, relies on them as well. As Lincoln explained in March of 1864, Grant's elevation to lieutenant general represented the, quote, nation's appreciation of what you have done and its reliance upon you for what remains to do in the existing great struggle, unquote. A newspaper account of the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. at the close of the war captured the opinion that really was held across the North that Grant and Sherman's veterans, more than 150,000 of whom marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, quote, are the champions of free governments who have saved the world as they have saved the Union, unquote. Success during the war did not come immediately, especially for Sherman. He failed as an independent commander late in 1861, magnifying Confederate threats and suffering a crippling loss of confidence. On January 1st, 1862, he confessed to his wife, quote, the idea of having brought disgrace on all associated with me is so horrible to contemplate that I really cannot endure it, unquote. Only service under Grant retrieves Sherman's reputation. Sherman, who never underestimated his own talent, readily acknowledged Grant's dominant position. He has said, he's quoted as saying, quote, "I'm a damn sight smarter than Grant. I know more about organization, supply, and administration, and about everything else than he does. But I'll tell you where he beats me and where he beats the world. He don't care a damn for what the enemy does out of his sight, but it scares me like hell," unquote. Sherman's assessment got to the heart of Grant's greatness. Steady confidence, will, and tenacity, together with a willingness to shoulder ultimate responsibility. Think of when McClellan's losing battles. He doesn't take responsibility for that. When Grant makes a mistake, he admits it. By having all those traits, it provided a calming framework within which Sherman thrives.